Let's take a look at chapter 23, the DOM and events. Up until now, you have learned JavaScript, you've learned some HTML and even some CSS. Now you're going to put it all together and learn how to make a web page interactive. I'll talk first about JavaScript's history and how it works in the browser. Then we'll talk about the document object model itself. What is the DOM? What does that mean? Then how do you access information about elements on the page using JavaScript? And what do you do if you actually want to update those values? Then we'll talk about events and how you can capture the user's interaction and make changes on the page in response to that. And then we'll put it all together at the end with another little demonstration of a small app that you will kind of see me building from start to finish. So JavaScript was created in response to an issue they were having in the 90s as web pages were starting to become more common, where they realized that they needed something to run on the client side, on the browser side, to handle logic. So it was created in 1995 by the same people who had created Java, which is why they decided for marketing purposes to call it JavaScript, not knowing that 30 years later, people would still be confused about, are they the same language? Are they not the same language? And of course, they're not. But the thing was, they were having to reach out to a server every single time they wanted to do something like, user input validation on a form. And we had dial-up back then. We did not have high-speed internet. So it was very problematic. So they came up with JavaScript. And we even are going to be able to see JavaScript running in the browser using our dev tools, the browser development tools, because they have a console built in right there where we can see anything we log as we're running our JavaScript. It's a very useful tool, so we'll have lots of chances for you to see that. Okay. So there's a couple different ways that you can actually put JavaScript in your HTML document. Either way, you're going to be using a script tag, and you can put that in the head or you can put it in the body. But you can either have your JavaScript in a separate JavaScript file, and maybe you could just call that script.js if you just have the one, and you would then link it with the source attribute, just like this. So you have a script tag and you say source equals, and then give the name of the file. And maybe, if you have a path to that file, all of that would go there. That's how you would link it to a separate file. And again, that can be either in the head or at the end of the body. It does not matter. It will catch it either way. Or you could do it internally. Maybe you just have a small amount of JavaScript and you want to just go ahead and put it in the HTML document itself. You can do that. You just actually put it between those script tags, and you don't need a source attribute because you're not actually linking to anything outside of that document. We're going to see examples of that in a moment, but let me talk about the document object model, the DOM. So what does it mean to have JavaScript objects in relation to elements on a page? It turns out every single element in your HTML file can be represented by a JavaScript object. So think about that for a second. You've got a paragraph, you've got a div, you've got, some sort of section, or maybe it's even just a span. Any of those things can be represented by JavaScript. And so it gives you all the information you need to know about the element. You can access it with your JavaScript. So, maybe it's content like nested elements, nested text, or maybe it's styling. If it's in line on the element, it will be able to read it. And there's much more information that we're going to be able to see. So JavaScript can read this information, and it can also update it in the browser and say, I would like you to change the text to this or change the style to this. And we're going to learn how to do that. The one thing to keep in mind is that while it can read from the HTML, it doesn't interact with the CSS file directly. So if you want to make any styling changes, once you make those changes, it's actually applied in line to the element, and from then on, it's just overwriting whatever its original value was from the CSS file. So this diagram here kind of shows, how this might work, right? You have a JavaScript file, an HTML file, a CSS file. They're all linked to the HTML file. And the browser takes that and says, okay, I'm going to have a JavaScript file I'm going to run, and I have a working copy of the HTML that I use, and I'm rendering the page based on that. So those are, constantly, in process, making changes on the page. The CSS document doesn't change. It was there from the beginning, and the browser has the knowledge of it. But as you're making changes, it's going to start applying those styling changes to the HTML inline. So we'll see how that can make a difference in just a moment. How do you actually do this with code, right? How do you represent an HTML element with a JavaScript object? So you can think of the relationship like this. If you have an HTML attribute, so over here, something like ID or style, that becomes an object property. So in a JavaScript object like this, you see ID and style then are properties, right? They're key value pairs. And you'll notice that the HTML attributes and CSS properties that you're using all are in kebab case, right? Lowercase hyphenated, like font size right here. But the corresponding object properties are always going to be camel case, which is consistent with JavaScript. So see how font size here has font and then capital S size, no hyphen, right? So just keep in mind that that's always going to be the relationship between those two is, kebab case for the HTML and the CSS and camel case for the JavaScript. There are other special DOM properties and methods that will allow us to interact with this HTML. Inner HTML is a common one. You'll see I've got it right down here. We don't see that property listed here like an attribute, but it exists. And what it represents is whatever is in between those tags. So if the P is the element that I'm looking at, if this object represents the paragraph, I see the ID, the style with its key value pairs here, font size 14 pixels. And then I also see this other property, inner HTML, and it shows me, that it's just text, testing 1, 2, 3, right? So this is the element in the HTML document. And down here is a partial representation of the JavaScript object with all of its data about that element. So we see again, HTML attributes end up translating down to as properties, as do, the CSS property here. Those all get represented down here, plus, additional properties like inner HTML. Okay, I want to look at a couple of objects that are already there for you to look at without you actually having to refer to any specific things on your page. The DOM gives you the big picture by allowing you access to the window object. So you can get information about the entire page, and you can, use console log and log the window just to see that object and its properties in the console. And you can use, some of the helpful properties are things like, the path name or the URL, what the inner height and width are of the window in case you want to do calculations for where you're putting something on the page. And there's also methods. There's helpful things like alert, which, pops up a message to the user and then they can just say, okay, and it doesn't really return a value. There's also confirm, which pops up a message, but then it asks you to either say okay or cancel, and then that returns a Boolean true or false, which means you are able to give the user a way to, do some logic for you and say, would you like to do this? And your code can do one thing or do something else depending on how they answer. Let's take a look real quick at a example I've got here where we can just do just that. We're going to log the window object and kind of take a look at how these alert and confirm boxes work. I need to actually get this up in the browser. So what I'm going to do is open it with Live Server, the extension that I've got here. Okay, and we see my little page that has hardly anything on it. What I really want to show you here is the dev tools. Okay, so in the dev tools, I've opened it up and I'm on the JavaScript console, which means anything that I actually log from my script here is going to show up here. So let's do it. I'm going to console.log window. And then it updates and we see right here the window and all of the information about this page. That's a lot of information, right? And it is. It's a ton of information. There's so many different things that we could, get into and learn about and make use of if we needed to. So you can explore that to your heart's content if you would like. Let's practice using these alerts. So what if we wanted to create an alert? Okay, so I'm just going to paste this in window.alert. Click OK after you've read this message. And we see that because I've got live server running, it already is up there, right? Click OK after you've read this message. As soon as it reloaded the page, it put it up. And then I could say OK, and then the code moves on. I'm going to comment that out though, because I want to do a confirm and I don't want that to keep popping up every time I make changes. So let's try doing a confirmation. This time I could do something like this. Let's see, I'm going to put in, here's some code. So I need to confirm. You can choose OK or cancel, and you can see that here. Notice though, I've had to store this in a response because I need to know, is that true or is that false? And I have to have somewhere for that value to go when it's returned from confirm. And so I've stored it in response, and then I've console logged response so we can see it. So it's not there yet, but as soon as we say what that is, we're going to see either true or false. So if I say OK, we see true. And let me refresh it. This time I'll say cancel, and we see false. So that's how that works. You can ask the user to give you a response using this little window, and then do something with that response afterward. Okay, there's also the document object that you can use to represent just the HTML on the page, not all of the other information. And we can log that as well. To take a look, I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do that. Because in addition to logging, you can also use console.dir and view the object representation to see all of the extra information that's included. Some of the helpful properties would be things like document.title or document.body. And we're going to see ways that we're going to be able to use that. We'll actually use it quite a bit when we're going to identify specific elements that we want to represent with JavaScript. But first, let's just look at the whole thing. So I could start off here by just doing a console.log of the document. And maybe I'll identify that by saying like, this is the document log or something like that. Okay. Let's take a look at that over here. All right, so we see document log, and I can kind of expand this, and we can see the representation of the elements, everything here. And you'll notice that this looks a lot like it does when you're on the elements part of the DevTools here. It's pretty much the same thing, but you can see all of it, right? What if you wanted to know the actual representation of JavaScript? Then you can use console.dir and do the document that way. Okay, so we have the log and we see what we saw before, but if we look at this one, this is actually looking at all of the properties, the JavaScript properties that are available to us. And so we see a lot of the same things we saw with window because a great deal of what we looked at from the window was related to the document. Okay. So how do you represent specific elements? How do you go in and say, I want to do something with this paragraph or this div? First of all, it's a good idea to store it in a constant so you can't overwrite it to represent a different element accidentally. And then you can use this method, getElementById, and you can just call it on the document. Say document.getElementById and give it the ID of the element, assuming it has one. That would be one way to do it. So in this example here, I've said, const intro. I gave it a name. So this is my variable that represents this object. And then I've created the object by saying document.getElementById and saying the string intro, which is the ID. You can also use query selector. This works for all selector types, not just IDs. And if you have multiple results, because maybe you're searching for a bunch of divs, or maybe it's a class and you have more than one element that uses that class, it's just going to return the first one it finds. But you can use that syntax like this, where you would say document.querySelector and then give it a string, but you need to indicate what type of selector it is. So in this case, if I'm using an ID, I would have the hashtag in there to say this is an ID. Either way, once I have that object created and stored in my variable, I can use that variable to access the properties. because they're just key value pairs in that object. So I can say intro.innerHTML, and for this particular file, if we go and we look at this here, we can see I've got the inner HTML of the element that has the ID of intro is testing123. There we go. And similarly, if I try to go and look at the font size, I can see that it's 14 pixels because that's actually something that I put in line on here. It's not part of my style sheet where, maybe I say the color is, red. Right now, the browser cannot see that because it's not actually in line on the element. So if I were to try to go see intro.style.color, that would not work. So let's take a look at what this is like with our script and come over and do this. So I've got this created. Intro is document.getElement by ID, and I've passed it the ID intro. So I can go ahead and show you those two that I just was talking about. And we can see right there, testing123 is the inner HTML, 14 pixels is the font size. Intro.style.font size, because remember, that has a nested object to get to all of the key value pairs that are actually the CSS. Now this one is the one we said we're not going to be able to get this one, intro.style.color. And sure enough, there's nothing there. You could see that it's line 27 in the script, but it has no value. It can't find it. So what if you wanted to start updating some values? You can do it the same way. You access them and then just change the values. So you could, it could be text, it could be an entire block of HTML that you change with the inner HTML property. And then if you want to change style of something, maybe it's color or it's font, or, gosh, lots of different things. The background color of the page, you can use the style property to do that. So in this example, we have, inner HTML, we can change it from saying testing123. We can change the color from red to green, even though it was originally red in the CSS, in the styles.css file. We can actually change it. And once we do that, we're going to see that it actually puts it in line so that it would join the font size here as part of the style. And then we actually can access it and read those values. We could change the font size too. So let's do a little bit of that. And then we'll log the values so we can also see them in the JavaScript. Let me take this out. Because I have live server running, we're going to be able to see these changes taking place in real time. So I'm going to pull that up. And I'll just say, let's go ahead and change the value of the inner HTML and say ready to go. And now we see it change, ready to go. Now let's change the color. We'll change it to green. And now we see it says ready to go and it's green. And then let's change the font size and change it to 48 points. Boom. Okay, so it's really big and it's green and it says ready to go. All three of those were made pretty much at the same time because it happened so fast. Okay, we did say that, if I was to try to change some of the other aspects, that they would be added in line. So let's do some other things. Let's change the style of the font weight and make it bold. All right, and there we see it in bold. And I'll do the font style as well and make it italic. All right. So I'm going to do something just so we can see what it shows all of these properties as being. I'm going to console log intro, the entire element. And maybe I'll, give it a little bit of a label there so we can for sure see it the way we expect to see it. Right, and we see intro, font size is 48, color is green, weight is bold, style is italic. So we see all this information about it right here now that we have made some of these changes. And if I wanted to, I could also come in here and, start logging some of the individual properties again and verifying that. So like intro dot style dot, font style. And I can access those values individually. Okay, so what I would recommend is that you just go in and start playing around with this. Identify a specific element, just like I did with intro here. I had this, I put an ID on it, and I used get element by ID to create a JavaScript object that represented this. And then I was able to interact with all of its properties and start, just looking at them at first, but then I started actually changing them. And then I can see evidence of that change when I log that object again. Now, there's one more thing I wanted to show you before I move on, and that's this idea of, how do you use these different methods? Get element by ID and query selector. And there's a few others, query selector all and get elements by class name. How do you decide which ones to use? It really just depends on what it is that you need to isolate. And so ID, obviously, you only can have one ID for any element on a page. So that's going to mean you're always specifically getting one thing. So if we were to look at what's going on here, you can see, for example, in here, each of these items that I've got, I'm going to pull this over just a little bit so you can see a little better. That's not really what I wanted to do, but okay, there we go. You can see that, this one has an ID called specific box. So of all of the different things that are in all of these rows, all of these different little boxes that I've got, it's the only one that has that ID, specific box. So if I hover over this, I've got it set to just show us that one. Whereas this one, query selector, I'm querying by specific tag. So I'm looking for an H3. There are two H3s on this page. You'll notice there's one up here and there's another one down here, but it's only finding the very first one. Query all by tag lets me find the list of them. So in this case, I discovered, oh yeah, there's both of them, and I'm able to, change the values of both of them at the same time. This one is another where I just isolate one with a single ID, but I use query selector and just give it the ID. So you can use this one instead of this one, and they pretty much do the same thing. And there's multiple ways to do it in terms of the syntax. So I've kind of included some notes on this too, if you want to look at this later. This one is querying all by class. So I just am going through and saying, find everything that has the class name, in this case, row 0, and it found everything in row 0. We could kind of see that here. Rows, all 5 of these have row 0. And so this one over here is looking for everything in column 3, get elements by class name. And then this one, I use get all by class to just say everything that has the class box, just go find that. So I hope this is a helpful little tool that you can see how these work a little bit differently to identify the elements you're looking for. Let's talk about events. So the idea of an event is that every time the user clicks on the page, or types something into a box or scrolls their mouse up and down, lots of different things. When they're interacting, the browser is keeping track. So you can make use of that to actually make your page dynamic. Every time an event is triggered, the browser knows about it, and all you have to do then is capture it. So you can capture that event as it's happening and then handle it with your code. Use JavaScript to make a change on the page and give the user an interactive experience. Here are some of the most common mouse events. We're going to work with some of these today. Click, double click, mouse over, mouse out, mouse down, mouse up, mouse move, drag, drop. There's keyboard events like key press, key up, key down. Window events, load, scroll, resize. Form events, we're not going to talk about forms today, but when we do, we'll be talking about some of these. Submit, input, change, reset, focus, and blur. So many events that you could potentially capture and make use of that to make your page interactive. So it's helpful to understand how the browser is handling these events, what the sequence is, so that you know where it is that you're tapping into it. So there's, this relationship between the browser and your code. First, the user triggers an event, and then your script actually executes the function for that event, updates the browser's working copy of the HTML, and then it actually re-renders to reflect whatever changes have been made. So here's step one. The user triggers something. JavaScript says, oh, hey, I've got some code that needs to be executed for that. I was looking out for that event to happen, and now that it has, I've got a function I want to execute. And so it executes a function, and the browser updates its copy of the HTML and says, okay, I've got something new that I need to render. So it re-renders. And this, of course, happens in a split second, right? So you can have this happening, cycling through, making multiple changes in a second. And the user is going to see it all happening nice and smoothly, generally speaking. So there are a number of ways to handle events, and there's primarily two different ways that you can set your JavaScript to do this. This way, which is less common these days, would be to just do it in your HTML document. This is the way it was done 20 years ago, where you would just put a little script in your HTML document and have it handle everything right there in the tag. So this is how it would be done. You would declare a function inside your script tags between them and just call it, like in this case, we're looking for a click. So we're going to say handle click. And all I'm doing is console logging. I clicked the button, so you can see that I clicked the button, right? And then you would just, call it from there and actually make sure it's going to get triggered, though, by putting it on the tag itself. So you'll notice if it's a click event, then I call that attribute on click. You just put an on before the name of the event. So I say, whenever there's a click, run this function, and I call handle click. And boom, it goes ahead and runs it. So that would be one way to do it. However, the more common way to do it would be to have an event listener set up in your external JavaScript, where you actually you have an element that has been identified, and you have an object in JavaScript to represent that element, and then you're listening for an event on that element. So instead of using an attribute in the tag, you just do it in your script. First of all, identify the object that you want to listen to. So in this case, I've got a button, right? I'm going to say, here's my button. I'm calling it num button. And then I'm going to add this method, add event listener, to that object to say, okay, JavaScript, pay attention, listen for this event when the browser, creates it. And then here's the function that I would like to give you to execute whenever you detect that event happening. And then you just give it a function. So let's look a little closer. That's the concept. Let's look a little closer at what that is with the syntax. Add event listener is a higher order function. It takes two arguments. The first one is the name of the event. Is it a click event? Is it a mouse over event or a focus event? It could be lots of different events. But if it happens to that particular object that you're attaching this method to, it's going to detect it. And then the function, you can either already have a function defined by name and just pass in the name of that by reference, or you can create an anonymous function and just write, this is what I want you to do whenever that event is detected. So here's the exact same code that you just saw, but you could see, bits and pieces here. So first of all, there's an object num button. So I use that object and I call the method of add event listener on that object. Say on the num button, listen for a click. That's what we're listening for. When you detect the click, execute this function. Okay, I've got a couple other little programs that I'd like to show you, a little application. One is to demonstrate click events, just the basic click event. And I'm going to open up the dev tool so we can actually see what's happening here. Let's identify this box here. I want to actually pay attention to the styling of this box, and also the HTML here. So if we look at this, right now you just see a box, right? ID is box. Here's a simple box. That's it. As I click on these buttons, we're going to start changing the properties of those box, and you're actually going to see some of these new stylings be added to the box, and you're going to see them added in line. And you'll also see them added here. Right now it says element.style, and there's nothing here between the brackets because there's no inline styling. Everything we have, you can see, is coming right now from styles.css. Right here at line 110, we've got box. Right here at line 43, we've got the div. So any styling you see on this box is only coming from the CSS. But let's click on these and see what happens. All right, so I changed the border to red. We now see that the style has a border color of RGB 1673613. And we see it right here too, right? And then I click on it and I make it blue and it changes. You see it update here and update here. Let's come down here and make the thickness of the border 8 pixels. All right, now we have another property that's been added in line, and now we change it to 4 pixels, and it's been updated again. What if we change the style of the border? Now we have a third property that's been added, dashed, double, dotted. So I can sit here and keep, playing around with this and changing all of these properties, and every single time it detects the click event, it's applying that particular property to that box for me. Because I have all 9 of these buttons wired up, and it's listening for the clicks. And then we're actually changing the properties of a different element. We're changing the properties of this box. So there you go. That's an example of how your JavaScript is detecting those events and making changes on the page. This one actually deals with other types of events. We have the simple click like you saw before, but you can also have something only change when you double click it. So if I try to click on this once, nothing happens, but if I double click, we see the change. Here we have mouse over and mouse out. So mouse over and mouse out. This one, I'm mousing over and it's actually changing both buttons because I have JavaScript that can handle it. Because you could do something like this with just CSS if you wanted to, if it's just one button, but I'm actually doing it for both of these with JavaScript. And then this one, mouse down and mouse up, I have to actually press it and hold it to see the change. And as soon as I let go, it changes back. And then of course there's the canvas element where you can do mouse move and play around with drawing on the screen and then clear canvas. All of these things done with just a little bit of JavaScript. We're just doing event listeners. That's it. What happens when you want to write a whole thing, not just a couple of little random things here and there, but really put together a whole app from start to finish? You want to think about how you're going to organize your code and how you're going to approach it. So I want to talk about that for just a minute. First of all, you need a load listener that will actually make sure the window has loaded, and then it will start executing your code. So we're going to have that first. And then you can either have a separate function that you provide for that holds all of your objects and your listeners, or you can just code it directly inside that same function. But the point is, you want to arrange your code in a very logical order. You want to keep it organized because you're going to have a lot of different things happening all over the place. And if you kind of put just anything anywhere, you're going to get lost pretty fast. And you also need to pay attention to scope, because if you declare an object to represent an element on the page and you need access to that object from this method over here or that method over there, if it's not in scope, you're not going to be able to access it and make changes. So here's my typical format for how I go through organizing something like this. I start at the very top by declaring and fetching any data that I need for content or styling. Now, we're not learning about fetch just yet. We're going to do that in the future. But I might have data that I want to work with that I can just declare right at the top. Then I could create objects for elements that exist in the page that I know I'm going to need to work with. And I might put all of those together. Then maybe I have some code I need to run to go ahead and put content on the page that needs to be displayed immediately, even though the user has not interacted with the page yet, like today's date or something like that. Then I would start putting my listeners. Okay, I've got some objects that I can listen to. Let's go, actually specify which events that we want to listen for, and then make changes to the code so we can interact with the user. And if we need any additional objects because maybe it's elements that don't need to be in scope for the other listeners, you can certainly create those inside, for like a one-time use type of thing inside one of those listeners. That's fine. If you have helper functions that really are just there to, like a utility function, something that rounds to a certain decimal or goes and finds a random index for you, things like that, and it really doesn't even have anything to do with the objects themselves and interactions on the page, just throw those at the very end. They don't even have to be inside the other main function because you can just call them from down there. So this is how I usually organize things. It helps me keep everything straight when I do it in a logical order like this. Okay, so let me kill live server on the other one. And we're going to take a look at this random number generator. I'm going to open up the index page here. I'll right click on this and say open with live server. Okay, and we have a little page here. I'm going to get the dev tools open. Chapter 23 demo, we have a little box inside here that says today's date is, but we don't have a date. We're going to need to provide that with JavaScript. And then we have a button here that says click me and it says want a random number, click me, and I'm clicking and nothing's happening. That's because I have not yet set this up. So we have a good place to start, but we need some JavaScript to make this interactive, right? So I'll come over here and also open up the styles so you can see that I've got a bunch of CSS here that's styling this page. I even have a keyframe definition down here for spinning the button. And later we're going to learn how to dynamically add this spinning class so that it will spin for us. So a lot of different things we're going to do here in order to make this page kind of fun and interactive. So here's our script. This is where the magic happens because JavaScript is what makes it interactive, right? So I'm going to do everything kind of in the order that I told you about. I've started out with window.addEventListener and load because you have to listen for the window to load before you can then run your code. Otherwise, it executes it too soon. So I've created an anonymous function and everything we're going to do is inside that anonymous function. And that's fine. Now, if you had a separate function and you wanted to just refer to it here, that'd be fine. But I'm just going to do it all here. Okay. So the first thing I do now is I'm going to create the objects that I need for everything that's in scope, that needs to be in scope for my listeners down here. And if I have an element that's not on the page yet, because I'm adding that element later, I obviously cannot define that here. I'd have to do it later. But for now, we can go ahead and create a couple of things. So you can see I've got a number of different elements here. Let's take a look at the HTML. I'm going to change the size of this for a minute. Here we go. So we can see that a little better. All right. So you can see that I've got a main section, and inside that I've got a div that has the date box here. Up here is the header, and then I have the date box. And then I've got another little group here where I've got, the question, do you want a random number? And then it has the button. And after that, there's a box that exists here, but there's nothing in it. It's called numbox. And that's where I'm going to put my random number. Now, right now, I just have 0 in there as kind of the default inner HTML of the span, but you can't even see that because it's currently hidden. You can see numbox has a visibility that's hidden. So this is a great way to make things, optionally shown on your page. This is one way that you can do it is with visibility. So we're going to change that. We're going to make it where once we're ready to look at it, we can make it visible. But you can see I've got IDs on a number of things. We're going to need to have objects that represent some of these things. So let's go over and take care of that first. So I'll declare a constant, call it date, And then I'll go to the document and say get element by ID and pass in the string date as the ID. Because if we go back here, we can look and see that date is the ID of this little paragraph. That's what I want. I just want, right now it says today's date is. I would like to finish that and say that, the rest of the sentence. So we're just going to tack on to it. So here is where I've got my section for code that needs to be run immediately, right? As soon as the page loads, I want this to update. So I don't want to put it inside of a listener that's waiting for the user to interact. I would just want to go ahead and do it. So right here, I will just add text. So I'll go date.innerHTML and say plus equals. So it'll take the existing inner HTML and just add more onto it. And I'll use a template literal and create a new date and then just call the date method to locale date string so that it'll put it, no matter where somebody is in the world, it'll put it in their time zone. Okay. And we see right here, today's date is 4/14/2024. Okay. Which is the date I'm recording this. Probably not the date you're watching this. Okay, so that works. And now we have already some information on the page that we dynamically added with JavaScript. So this is a great first step. Now we want to work on the part where we actually make the page interactive for the user. So the next thing we would need to do here, we want a click event listener for the button that generates a random number, right? We click on this and it generates it. And we're also going to need to make that div visible. So we need both of those things. We're going to need, actually, we need three things. We need the button that we're going to click on so that we can detect that click event. We need the box because that's what's currently hidden and we need to make that visible. And then this random num span right here is where we want to update the number once we do click on the box. So three different things that we have to have objects for three different reasons. So we'll create the objects first. I'll say const num button. Go to document.getElementById and give it num-button. Then I'll do it again for numBox. And the third one will be the random num. Notice that I'm naming these pretty closely to their equivalents in the HTML file. I typically do that for consistency's sake, to be specific. So if this is num button, I just put it in camel case, num box, put it in camel case, etc. That's a good convention to use so that everything has that one-to-one relationship and there's no confusion about what belongs to what. If you start giving them names that are too different, you start losing track of what represents each thing. Okay, so now that I have these, I can put listeners on listener on the button, right? We want to listen for that and when someone clicks on it. So I can say num button add event listener. And remember, this takes two arguments. First is what is the event we're listening for? I'll say click. And then what do you want me to do when I detect the click? And so I'm going to just put an anonymous function in place. And now I can put the code inside that should execute whenever that actually takes place. So all of these to-dos, I'm actually going to move up into here because they're things that we want to put into place to execute when the button is clicked. The other thing that I want to do is just quickly take a look at, before we do the next to-dos, I want to take a look at what some of these objects are, right? So I can console.log num button and also console.dir num button. And we can come over and take a look at that. Okay, so immediately we see, here's the element in question, right? Button with an ID num button, it says click me. And then here's the information about that button. So if there's anything that you need to know, like, what classes might be assigned to it. And I mean, there's all the events that could be happening. There's, information about its style here. If you ever need to look up any sort of information about anything that it's keeping track of behind the scenes, use that console.dir and it'll let you see that. Otherwise, when you see console.log, you're just going to get the element itself. And we could do that, with the other ones if we wanted to too, but I think that's enough. Okay. So now let's look at the next to-do. We have a clickable button, and if I want to, for now, just to prove that it's working, I could just, put something temporary in here. Console log, I clicked the button, right? This is always a good idea, is to make sure that it's actually firing the way you expect it to. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you put in here. If it's not working, you're not going to see it happen. So let's just do this and just make use of our console here to register it. So yeah, I clicked the button. And it keeps adding up the number of times I've clicked the button. So yeah, I've clicked it 4 times now. It says 4 right there. So there we go. We know that it's working. That was kind of a temporary thing. Okay, so we're not quite done with to-do number 2. We actually still need to generate a random number. So I'm just going to create a local variable here. Let num equal, and I'm going to round it up with math.ceil, but we'll just do math.random. And let's just say it's going to be a number between 1 and 50. So I'll just say math.random times 50. And so now we have a number. How do we set it, right? So the object we said we were going to put the random number in was the random num, and we're just going to make it the inner HTML of that span that represents. If you go back over here, you can see that's a span with the ID of random number, and this is where the number belongs. So we can update that value with .inner HTML. I'll say random num .inner HTML should now have the value of whatever that number is. And then we need to make sure that we change the visibility of the number box, right? Because everything, like we could go right now and let me take that back off. We can click this and it's creating the number. In fact, we can even prove that it's creating the number by console logging the number and console logging random num.inner HTML. Yeah, 25, 50, 37, 21. So we see this happening over here, but it's not showing up on the page, and that's because we haven't made that box visible yet. So we'll say numbox.style.visibility is visible. Okay. Now we don't have any plans to ever make it hidden again. So the very first time we click the button, it's going to make it visible. And then after this, it'll execute this, but it doesn't change anything because it's just going to stay visible. Let's watch it. There we go. Now it's visible and we see 34, 29, 35, 14, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a great step. We now have our number showing up, but let's play around with it a little bit more. I'm just gonna take those out. Okay, let's play around with it just a little bit more because we want to actually start making some changes conditionally. What happens if you want to, actually decide this one thing should change, but only if this other thing is true? You can have conditional logic in here and handle that kind of logical process. Okay, so the first one here says change color of number to yellow-green if it's even, or coral if it's odd. Okay, the color of the number. So that means that it should apply to the span here, right? We just want to change the random number style, and that should be enough. We don't want to change the entire box or anything like that necessarily. Although that's the only text in the box, so you probably could do it that way, but let's be specific. We're going to change the number. So I'm going to say if it's even or if it's odd. So I need a little bit of logic. Let's say if the number that we calculated mod 2 is 0, Then we're going to change the random number style color. So random num.style.color to yellow green. I have 3 L's. Yellow, green. There we go. And otherwise, random num.style.color will be coral. Let's try it out. And there we go. The odd numbers are coral. And every time we get an even number, it's green. Okay. So it says here, bonus, also change the page background to match. Now we don't have an object here to represent the page background, but we don't need to create one because we can just go to document.body and access it directly. So I'll go to document.body.style.background color. And remember again, background color is camel case when you're accessing it through JavaScript instead of being kebab case. So I'll do the same color, yellow, green. And then here, we can do the same thing and make it coral in the case where it's odd. All right, let's try it out. Yeah, now we have a much more obvious change, right? When everything matches, when the background is also changing. Cool. All right. To-do number 4, if the random number is evenly divisible by 3, add the spinning class to the button, otherwise remove it. Okay, so here's something interesting. You can actually add or remove classes using JavaScript by accessing the class list. So I'm going to put in my logic and say if the number is evenly divisible by 3 using numbod3, then I want to go to the button, go to its class list, and add the spinning class. Otherwise, good heavens, there we go. Otherwise, I want to go to the class list and remove spinning. So we're going to toggle it on and off this way. And you remember I showed you that the spinning class, all it does is go and invoke this keyframe for spinning and start spinning whatever I apply it to. In this case, it's going to be the button. So let's do it. 32 is not evenly divisible by 3. Neither is 28. 29. There we go, 27. Evenly divisible by 3, and we see the button spinning. And as soon as I click on it and get to a number that is not evenly divisible by 3, it stops spinning. So we can add and remove those classes dynamically like that. Because it's doing that math every single time it detects a click. It's running that entire function that we've created here. It runs it every single time. All right, the last one, I'm going to trigger an alert if the number is evenly divisible by 5. And we're going to see something interesting happen when I do this. If num mod 5 is equal to 0, then I want to trigger an alert, and I'll say the number num is a multiple of 5, exclamation point. And that'll be it. And then we're going to see something interesting happen. So let's run this. I'll click. I keep clicking. We haven't gotten a multiple of 5 yet. There we go. All right. So we get an alert that says the number 20 is a multiple of 5. Now, do you see 20 on the page? You do not see 20 on the page. So what's happening here is that behind the scenes, it's run this. I clicked on the button, it ran the listener function, and it calculated the number, and it got to the point where it was evaluating this to say, hey, there's an alert. But it hasn't actually re-rendered the page yet. So we actually see the alert pop up before it's rendered the page, because that's the last thing that the browser does. And sometimes it's doing things simultaneously. That's called a race condition. And there's a way we can deal with a race condition in JavaScript, and that's to use set timeout. This was something that was talked about in your book when they talked about these higher order functions, that you have a function that takes a function. And so we'll give it a function to execute, and we'll tell it, just wait 50 milliseconds. That's all we need is 50 milliseconds. And then I can put that alert inside here to say, after 50 milliseconds has elapsed, then go ahead and do this. And by then it will actually have rendered the page, and we should see the number 20 on the page, or whatever number it's going to be, because now we're going to start over. So let's let it start back over. All right. We'll click. There we go. The number 35 is a multiple of 5, and we can see that it does in fact show 35. So that's how you deal with just making sure that things appear to the user in the order that you want, even if your code is executing in a slightly different order than you expect. Just use set timeout and make a small adjustment. Okay, so that's the demo. You can see we have made this very interactive. We provided some information even before the user started interacting, and then we made this button do a number of different things for us. It's changing colors, it's changing numbers, it's adding classes, it's throwing up an alert. Very interactive. Okay. The last thing that I want to say is that I do have some exercises on my website that have to do with the DOM. Some of these are the things I just showed you with, the basics of click events and how to use, different methods like get element by ID and query selector. If you want to play around with those, by all means, you can find those here and do that. I also have a bunch of little applications that I developed just using JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. I've got a Dungeons and Dragons dice roller. I've got this little dazzle words thing where you put in a phrase and it makes it all sparkly and fancy, and you can change the color. I've got this kaleidoscope game that's fun to play around with. Lights out game is kind of a classic game. So you can see here lots of things for you to look at that are created just with the DOM. And there are ways for me I learned a lot of new things in the process of playing around and making some of these things when I was first graduated from LaunchCode and just wanted to keep practicing. All right, I also have some assignments that would help you prepare for graded assignment 5. Now, only one of these, the inspired design, is just the things we covered today. You'll have to wait to do Pour Me Another and Trivia Time until we cover forms and fetching, because both of those involve that content. But this one is just about doing the kinds of things we talked about today. Just make something interactive, bring changes on the page when the user interacts. And it's just as simple as using a simple button to do that. So if you want to go ahead and start getting some practice, you can check that out. For the studio for this class, you're going to go to your starter code, and you're going to make a web page interactive with DOM objects and event listeners, just like I just demonstrated for you. You can have fun with that, and I'll see you next time.